Assalamualaikum everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the session 16 of the LUMS live webcast brought to you by the Office of Advancement and the Mehboob al-Haq Research Center at LUMS. And just to plug in the Mehboob al-Haq Research Center, it's a center that supports interdisciplinary research on human development, social exclusion and inequality across South Asia. Thank you especially, by the way, if you're joining us, because you want to hear four historians speaking about COVID-19. और historians की एक तरह से आवाज़ जो है, जैसे कि आप जानते हैं, वो कम सुनी जाती है, वैसे हमारा एक माशरती अलमिया भी है, और बिलखुसूस जब पैंडेमिक्स की बात आती है और कोविड-19 की बात आती है, तो मेरे ख्याल से कहना गलत ना होगा कि historians की एक तरह से आवाज़ जो है वो इस पब्लिक कॉन्वर्सेशन में एक तरह से मिसिंग है। और जो हमारी काविश और हमारी कोशिश इस सेशन में यही होगी कि हम जो हैं एक तरह से एक गुफ्तगू का आगाज करें कि जिससे हम बुनियादी तौर पे सवाल उठाएं कि हम तारीख से हम क्या सबक सीख सकते हैं जब कोविड-19 की बात आती है। मेरे साथ तीन नहायत ही काबिल और नहायत ही क्वालिफाइड एक्सपर्ट्स हैं और मैं अभी उनका तारुफ कराना चाहूँगा। पहले तो हमारे साथ जो हैं वो हैं अली उस्मान कासमी साहब। He is an associate professor of history at LUMS. And Ali Qasmi has written prolifically about many issues, but I would just like to plug in one series that he does these days. और Ali Qasmi साहब जो हैं वो आजकल एक हिस्ट्री सीरीज क्यूरेट करते हैं, वो YouTube पे है, प्लीज लुक इट अप। उसका नाम मुकदमा है। और रिसेंटली अली कासमी ने एक सेशन रिकॉर्ड किया था, एक लेक्चर रिकॉर्ड किया था जो कि 1918 के इन्फ्लुएंजा एपिडेमिक के बारे में था, जो कि बड़े सजन में पेश आया था। इसके बाद हमारे साथ जो हैं वो हैं डॉक्टर आमना खालिद। शी इज एन एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर ऑफ हिस्ट्री at Carleton College in Minnesota. She completed her DPhil from the University of Oxford in the history of medicine, and she's also very close to us in the sense that she is an alumnus from LUMS. And so welcome, Amna. Thank you so much for taking out the time, especially at this time of the day. I understand it's very early morning for you. And finally, last but not the least, we have Dr. Kasim Tirmizey, who very recently completed his PhD in environmental studies from York University in Canada. Congratulations, Kasim. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at LUMS in 2019. And currently, he's a part-time faculty member at Concordia University's Center for Engineering in Society. And most recently, Dr. Kasim Tirmizey authored an article on Jamhoor magazine. You can look at it up online. And the article was titled "Pandemics and Hunger: Lessons from the 1918 Pandemic in India." So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate the time that you took out. And I guess I have a list of questions, and we'll proceed through this question as we go along. And I suppose the first question that I have to ask all three of you is perhaps the most straightforward one. And the question is this: is this really unprecedented? We have a tendency to sometimes think about living in unprecedented times, about thinking of that this has never really been experienced before. And so my question is this really uncharted terrain, or is there a precedent to this? Ali Qasmi, if I could come to you first, if you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me properly?
Loud and clear.
ज़बरदस्त। अच्छा, बहुत शुक्रिया अली रज़ा। ये मेरे ख्याल में एक तो आप कह रहे हैं ना कि unprecedented वाला, I think there's a lot of emphasis on how things have already happened in the past, and what's happening is just a kind of a replication of what has already happened. तो ये वाली feeling भी बहुत ज़्यादा है। और अगर खास तौर पर history of epidemics को देखें और इस pandemic को compare करें influenza epidemic of 1918-1919, तो resemblance इतनी ज़्यादा है कि it's almost like it becomes scary. And what becomes even more sort of frightening is the fact that there is little kind of understanding or appreciation for that kind of past and to learn from it. कि जो आदाद शुमार हमें बताते हैं कि 1918-19 के दौरान जब इन्फ्लुएंजा एपिडेमिक फैला, और वो फैला इस तरह के पहली जंग अजीम खत्म हो रही थी तो जो लोग हिंदुस्तान से फौजी वहाँ लड़ने के लिए गए थे वो वापस आना शुरू हुए, बॉम्बे और कराची की बंदरगाहों से वो अपने अपने इलाकों को वापस गए, इसी ज़्यादा कंसंट्रेशन हमें जो नज़र आती है लोगों की जो उससे हलाक हुए वो इन इलाकों में और पंजाब के वस्ती इलाकों में, क्योंकि रिक्रूटमेंट वहाँ से ज़्यादा थी, उस वक्त ये सिलसिला शुरू हुआ। और बल्कि बरतानवी जो हुक्मरान थे उन्होंने इस बात पर इत्मीनान का सांस लिया कि शुक्र है कि जंग खत्म होने के बाद इतने लोग मर रहे हैं, वरना अगर उस दौरान इतना ज़्यादा मर जाते तो हम रिक्रूटमेंट कहाँ से करते। That was like one of the ways in which they were thinking about it. But also, I mean, if you look at the numbers, कि 4% हिंदुस्तानी आबादी का जो 1911 के सेंसस के मुताबिक 4% of the Indian population died as a result of this influenza, and as Kasim Tirmizey would tell us, the other factors were involved as well. But like 4% is like 12 million to 18 million of Indian people died, and yet there is very little memory of what happened. कुछ इसके बारे में हम ज़्यादा कल्चरल मेमोरी में ये एग्जिस्ट नहीं करती ये चीज़, और शायद इसकी एक वजह ये भी है कि आपको याद होगा जब आप वो करवा रहे थे पहले जंग अजीम के हवाले से, जब आप सेंटेनरी मुनक़िद की थी तो उस वक्त भी ये सवाल आया। फिर हमने जब ये अपना जलियांवाला बाग की सेंटेनरी के ऊपर ये सवाल आया कि लगता है यहाँ पर इतनी सेंटेनरीज हैं, क्या कहना चाहिए, गम की, अमवात की, डिजास्टर की, कि इंसान ये भूल जाता है कि किस किस चीज़ को याद रखे, किस चीज़ को वो भूल जाए। So ये जो epidemic की, जो influenza epidemic की history है, is one such history which has largely been forgotten. But if you look at the work which is extensive on the epidemic, especially about the global impact of the influenza epidemic, but even more so on, but a little bit on the Indian side of it, you will see कि इसके हवाले से जो इसके engagement है of the Indian population at that time is remarkably similar. So for example, David Hardiman का एक आर्टिकल है इस पर, और इसमें बताते हैं कि उस ज़माने में जो मुख्तलिफ तरह की आरा पाई जाती थी, आयुर्वेदिक एक्सपर्ट्स इसके बारे में क्या बातें कर रहे थे, क्या वो इंडिजिनस मेडिकेशन लोगों को सजेस्ट करते थे कि भी पाउडर्ड लॉन्ग पेपर मिक्स्ड विद जिंजर जूस एंड हनी ये पिए, उससे आप कंजेशन नहीं होगा, ब्रोंकाइटिस नहीं होगा, आप दूध में हल्दी मिलाकर पिए, तुलसी डाल के पिए, और इस तरह की तमाम बातें, जिस तरह की आजकल मेरे ख्याल में अदरक और लहसुन का बहुत जोर चल रहा है। और फिर ये है कि लोग कह रहे हैं कि भाई आप मास्क पहने, अपने आप को वो गरारे करें, ये सब चीज़ें, बट उसकी जो पब्लिक इम्प्लीमेंटेशन है इन चीज़ों की उस ज़माने में भी वो बिल्कुल नज़र नहीं आती। उसका इम्पैक्ट ये होता है कि डेविड आर्नल्ड ने जो स्टेटिस्टिक्स दिए हैं और जो उन्होंने डिस्क्रिप्शन दी है और जो रिपोर्ट्स हैं सैनिटरी कमीशन की या बाकी जो आर्काइवल मटेरियल है उस दौर का, वो हमें बताता है कि अस्पतालों में मरीज तो क्या, मुर्दे रखने की जगह भी बाकी नहीं बची। और कलकत्ता में वो बताते हैं कि फॉर एग्जांपल गालिबन 6 माह में या बहुत कम अरसे में 22,000 क्रीमेशन हुई, और इसी तरह मतलब लकड़ी कम पड़ गई कि लोगों को जलाने के लिए, मतलब इतने लोगों की अमवात हुई। सो एक कहने का मकसद ये है कि एक हिस्ट्री ऑफ डिजास्टर एग्जिस्ट करती है, आई मीन फॉर वेरियस थिंग्स, चाहे वो ताउन है, हैजा है, फ्लड है, अर्थक्वेक है, कोयटा का अर्थक्वेक इतना एक वाकया था 1930 की दहाई में, बिहार का अर्थक्वेक इतना बड़ा वाकया था। So that history of disaster in different forms exists, but somehow there is little that in which people associate with that past to have a bearing on the way they then encounter similar kind of processes in the contemporary world. So for now, I think मैं सिर्फ इतना ही कहूँगा, उसके बाद फिर आगे.
No, thank you for that. I think that's a good starting point. And if I could then build up from this and go to Amna. And I'm asking, I guess, Amna, I'm also asking you precisely because as a historian of disease and public health in colonial India, you have published extensively, you have written prolifically on the spread of academics, I was about to say academics. That's an equally big disaster, but yes. On the spread of, you've written extensively on the spread of epidemics and colonial governance and public health in colonial India. Your forthcoming book is also on that subject. And so I was wondering if, for you as a specialist on this subject, if this is pretty much more of the same.
Thank you, Ali. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me. In terms of whether this is the same and whether this is unprecedented or not, I think it's certainly true that we've had pandemics before. And if you look at the incidence of pandemics originating from South Asia, in particular cholera, jise Urdu mein heza kehte hain, it's nothing novel. In fact, the number of deaths was much higher in the 19th century due to cholera and then due to plague than what we are seeing today. So I think there is a tendency, which you highlighted earlier, that we like to think we live in exceptional times. That's partly because we're self-centered, but that needs to be tempered. We've seen this before. This is not novel. I'll say that over there, but I'd also like to say the other aspect which is not novel is how we understand disease and the kind of confusion around coronavirus right now and the modes of transmission. Now, I see a lot of frustration in the public discourse about what scientists are saying and what experts are advising. Mask pehne ya na pehne, should we be going out in public or not? Social distancing ka koi fayda hai ya nahi hai? These are all big questions, and every day what we see is that we get a new perspective on it. And I sense this frustration that, why are scientists not able to tell us what we ought to be doing? Well, this is nothing new. In part, that's because this is a new virus. If you look at cholera in the 19th century, for the bulk of the century, people had no idea how cholera was caused. And there were multiple theories of disease transmission and causation. That there were those who thought it was waterborne, and there were those who thought it was transmitted through miasma, which is like bad air around rotting, putrefying matter. And there was a lot of debate amongst scientists and medical experts about how exactly this is transmitted. So the kind of uncertainty and frustration we're feeling is also not novel. It's also very typical of new pandemics, new diseases that kind of break onto the global scene very suddenly. However, I would like to say there are certain things that are novel about our situation. And one of them is there is a tension when new epidemics come to the surface. The first is there is a tendency to blame right. Someone else for the right. outbreak. And we see that playing out right now. We see that playing out with Trump blaming China. We see that with the rise of conspiracy theories. Ye kahan se shuru hua, kisne banaya, jaan ke banaya, logon ko khas taur pe bimar kiya ja raha hai. This is nothing new either. But at the same time, where we are in this historical moment, we also see how deeply interdependent we are on each other in ways that we were not before. So we see the economic interdependence as well. You see in the US, there's a shortage of personal protection equipment, in part because all of the production of masks and these other gowns and other equipment has been outsourced to other parts of the world. And so there's a severe shortage that is being experienced over here that the US is unable to cope with at this particular moment. But I think it's also important to recognize, I'm not just talking about the economic interdependence that is being highlighted, it's also the interdependence of well-being. And while we are tempted often to blame others, what we also begin to see over here is how much the well-being of one section of society is contingent upon that of another section of society. So we cannot separate the well-being of the wealthy or the privileged from that of who are underprivileged, who are actually working right now to make sure that society keeps functioning as it is functioning, and that and they're basically critical in maintaining the health of people. So in the case of the US, much as Trump would like to demonize others and talk about how this is a virus that has come from outside and immigration should therefore be curtailed, what we also see is that people who are taking care of the majority of Americans on the front lines are actually immigrants. They're the nurses and doctors who come from, a lot of them come from South Asia actually, and from Mexico. So I think this is a moment where we begin to see that tension, it's thrown into sharp relief, where we can see how deeply interdependent we are on each other in a way that wasn't apparent earlier in earlier epidemics as starkly. But also at the same time, we see, with the rise of right-wing politics, how keen certain people are to see this as something that is coming from the outside and how it plays into the discourse of othering people. So I'll stop over there for now and look forward to.
No, thank you so much. I think that's a very important point that you raised, especially the point about increasing interdependence and how in some ways there's also a really poisoned chalice. I mean, there is, I suspect, I suppose, space for some kind of optimism, but also as you mentioned, with this emergence of far-right nationalism across the globe, there are also many things to be afraid of. I would like to park that and come back to it if that's okay, because I think that's an important point. But just to go on to Kasim and again to raise this question about, well, what is really so different after all? And Kasim, I'm turning to you especially. I'm turning to you with a very specific purpose, which is to remind our audience that it's not just about disease. There is an entire economic system that's obviously attached to this moment that is under severe stress. And that's something that you also raise and highlight in your article that you published recently, which was around food security and how it was tied to disease. And sometimes I think it's easy for us to isolate these different social phenomena and think that they're somehow disconnected from each other. So if you could bring that into the frame, which is to think about how disease generally and epidemics specifically, how they really raise some deeply in some really deep questions about the way that our social and economic structures are constructed. What, in other words, do they really reveal about our societies? So if you could speak a bit about that.
Okay. Yeah, so very good questions. I mean, one thing which I just want to start off with a quotation that's popular among epidemiologists, and that's, if you have seen one pandemic, you've seen one pandemic. And so in some sense that ignores then, okay, what's the point of history?
Right.
I think there's something important to also recognize that, each pathogen is unique in itself, like how it operates, is it waterborne, is it airborne, or that's something. But yet, at the same time, we can still see patterns from the past. And that's one thing is that, when a pathogen comes into a certain area, it doesn't naturally become a pandemic. It doesn't become widespread and it's infecting lots of people in a natural way. It's not, often we think about these things is that, oftentimes we think of this as an act of nature. This is happening to humans, it came from animals and now it's on humans. And we just think of this as a natural process. It's something which it was maybe, okay, once it's here, it's inevitable. But, we have to, and that's where history is really important, because when we start historicizing a pandemic, or how does a pathogen become a pandemic, we can start untangling the social and historical processes that made that pandemic a pandemic, or what made that pathogen into a pandemic. And so, if we go back into history, then, it's really difficult now at the present moment to unravel COVID-19, and academics and other people are trying to unpack the social and historical processes that make that happen. It's easier if we go back to, other periods, to cholera in the 19th century, or if we go to the influenza in 1918. And so we can see important patterns, and then it also reveals things about the present today. And so one thing which, as you were mentioning this article, I focused on the 1918 pandemic. And one thing, which is interesting because, also if you think about the 1918 pandemic, there's different theories, but one of the theories of its origin is that it came from the United States. So, also this kind of blaming of other countries, it's interesting that, it was possibly from a poultry farm or a pig farm in Kansas. And so if we go to that period, the pandemic, it also, is it comes to Europe on the trenches in World War I, and, it arrives through, because we have global warfare. you have global trade. And so you have, the British Indian Army coming in Mumbai, or what was called then Bombay, and, spreading, and that becoming an epicenter in the summer of 1918. And, that having a first wave and spreading across India. And then, in a second wave in the fall of 1918, that also spread. And statistics have already been shown, but around 18 million people died in India. And we have to ask, why was there 18 million people who died, and compared to that 2 million people who died in Europe? And so, and there, we can start seeing some more important things of why was that so uneven. And even when it did occur in India, this was happening at the same time as that there was a drought. There was the monsoons, which usually come in the summer, weren't as strong as they should have been, as in the normal circumstances. And so one consequence of a drought is that, we can often think, okay, droughts if there are severe droughts, they can lead to famines or food insecurity. But that's, again, it's not necessary that droughts lead to famines or droughts lead to food insecurity. It's how the social fabric is organized, how the economy is organized. And one thing, what we start seeing is, during the Mughal period or other eras, we don't have so much famines. I mean, we think that, India, we have this perennial problem of food insecurity, but there wasn't so much famines that occurred as much that they occurred during British colonialism. And, it's because of the transformations in the agrarian system that are happening in this period that lead to droughts becoming famines, and that famines with a pathogen becomes a pandemic. And some of those transformations that we start seeing, we start having, railways being built. Railways, and although in Pakistan we think of, the British, oh, how great they were, they left us railways. But, if you start looking at those railway tracks and how they're organized, or why is there a port in Karachi? Those were organized for the purpose of taking wheat outside of the country. And you look at the tracks, you can see them all going from, important agrarian areas to market cities, and those going to, Amrit, the catchment of all these agrarian areas, going to Amritsar, going to Multan, going to Lahore, and then feeding to Karachi. And this was the purpose of reorganizing the agrarian system, so that way, food was going outside of the country. And there's all sorts of things that start happening. People start getting allotted, some people getting allotted land, some were becoming landless. The whole structure of landlords we have today in Pakistan is a result of that. And so all these kinds of transformations were happening to make food go outside. So and there's an important thing, the Mughals also had grain stores, and so where they kept food in case of times of shortage. And there were also social systems where people redistributed food when there were shortages, which prevented famines from happening. And so, all that is part of this historicization of a pandemic, of how a pandemic or a pathogen becomes a pandemic. And so when you had the failure of monsoons, you had the failure of crops, and the failure of crops and food, was still going outside to England. And there became a food shortage, and where people had weakened immune systems, and it wasn't everyone who had weakened immune systems. And if you look at it in the statistics of who died more, Europeans, the British or upper caste Hindus, and let's say the wealthier, the elites, were they were affected, but they weren't as affected as low caste Hindus. And if we're thinking about, let's say, a place like Mumbai, or the poor and the peasants and the people in the countryside in Punjab. So, you see these kinds of inequities which were already existing. So it's not that the pathogen preys on inequities, but it's in times of a pandemic, it's those who, say, the weakened immunity, those who have to work, who, let's say we are doing Zoom sessions or doing Facebook Live, we can stay at home. But so it's because of the social conditions of how society is already hierarchized, there's already a hierarchy, which is based on a history, which is based on social dynamics, which is based on questions of power. And so in that period, you have people who are the lower class in Punjab who have 50% mortality rates. And those who are British had 5% mortality rates. It's not as if their bodies were somehow different, or some genetic or some pigmentation which makes this. It's the social conditions which are part of history, and that's why I think history is really important, to historicize this. And even if we look at cholera in the 19th century, we see similar dynamics, transformations in agriculture, which were really pivotal for making cholera into something which was widespread. I think I'll leave it kind of there, but that's like my argument for why we need to historicize and look at history to see in similar ways to looking at the present context, see how this pathogen of the COVID-19 is becoming a pandemic based on the historical and social factors.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point. Thank you for raising that, and thank you for reminding us that it's perhaps through this process of historicizing this history of disease, perhaps, that one can really get a sense of this really seminal point that you raised, that pandemics cannot only be thought of as forces of nature, as some kind of divine retribution, so to speak, which is the standard explanation that we sometimes have. But instead, I mean, they become pandemics because of human-made kind of like factors and processes that are driven by us, by human beings. And thank you too for reminding us that it really feeds into what is already an inequitous system, an unegalitarian system, perhaps. I think we can park. I would like to develop this a bit more, but perhaps we can come back to it, because we just received a question from our audience. And I was wondering, Amna, if I could throw that to you, because it's around conspiracy theories. You just spoke a bit about conspiracy theories, and I guess that some of the questions that we are receiving are around this response that we have towards pandemics, and how those responses in some ways take shape. Perhaps if you could speak a bit about that.
Thanks, Ali. Conspiracy theories are the hallmark of pandemics, especially when we're talking about a new virus or a new microbe, a new disease that has not been seen before. So if we look at history, we see, especially in the 19th century, you see that all kinds of explanations were at play about why cholera was caused, or why plague came to India towards the end of the 19th century. Let me give you a few examples of the kinds of conspiracy theories that were in play, and that'll help me highlight one of the points that I want to make. There was this idea that wells were being poisoned. जब ताउन फैला 1894 में हांगकांग से जब आया इंडिया में, तो ये ख्याल था कि लोग जो हैं वो खास तौर पे कुओं में जहर डाल रहे हैं, जिसकी वजह से ये बीमारी फैल रही है. फिर ये भी ख्याल आया लोगों को कि शायद कॉलोनियल स्टेट, जो हमारे बरतानवी हुक्मरान थे तब, वो ये करने की कोशिश कर रहे थे, लोगों को मारने की कोशिश कर रहे थे, क्योंकि पॉपुलेशन बहुत बढ़ गई थी इंडिया की, and to try and get that under control. Then there were other novel explanations, such as there was some kind of oil that was being extracted from the bodies, dead bodies of Indians, which was somehow going to be beneficial. In my research on cholera in India, one of the theories was that some particular oil was going to help Queen Victoria's longevity. कि वो तेल लगाएंगी या पिएंगी, ये मुझे पता नहीं, लेकिन उनकी जिंदगी लंबी हो जाएगी, और इस वजह से लोगों को मारा जा रहा है. लेकिन इससे ये वाज़ेह होता है कि ऐसे वक्तों में जो सोसाइटी की फॉल्ट लाइंस हैं, वो उभर के बाहर आती हैं, वो वाज़ेह हो जाती हैं. So what is it? These conspiracy theories are very common, and why are they common? That's one question, and what do they reveal is another question. Why they're common? Well, that's pretty straightforward for historians, I think, because it's a time of uncertainty. When things are unclear, when there is a sense of panic or uncertainty, especially when a disease is attacking people randomly, the way we make sense of it is critical. And a conspiracy theory allows you to explain something completely, very neatly. There's no complexity in that, and there's no way to disprove it. So if this is a conspiracy and you say, "Bhai, China ne ye shuru kiya," there's no way you can disprove that China has or hasn't started it. And it's a source of comfort. to think that somehow you can understand something that's going on that is defying explanation. So that's behind why these conspiracy theories come around. But what do they reveal to us? They reveal to us the kinds of psychological and social fault lines in a particular society. So, for instance, in the context of colonial India, when you see people blaming the colonial state, it shows to you, or it reveals to you, the distrust that they had of foreign rulers. It also shows to you the nature in which that kind of rule was operating. Its inequity is being played out in the ways in which people are making sense of the pandemic. So I think conspiracy theories are, as I said, they're a feature of all pandemics, and they're there for a reason. But it's very interesting what they reveal to us about a particular society. And it's also very interesting in terms of not just the kind of anxieties that there are in a society within, but also how they can be used to deflect attention. For instance, politicians may use them and may play the blame game to deflect attention from other issues which are far more important or that are vital to the pandemic. So to build on what Kasim said and to tie it into the conspiracy theory, for instance, in the case of the US, what we see is that the focus on how this has come from China fundamentally ignores the kinds of social circumstances and the kinds of socioeconomic inequities within the US that have made this a pandemic. So the fact that poor people are unable to access healthcare because of a lack of access to medical insurance is being overshadowed by the fact that this has come, or by, not the fact, by the theory that this has come from outside. So it helps to kind of diffuse the shortcomings within.
Thank you for that. Or I would just like to raise an earlier point that you made, जो आपने बात की कि जिस तरह से पेंडेमिक्स जो है वो एग्जिस्टिंग फॉल्ट लाइंस को मजीद एक तरह से उनको शायद एम्पलीफाई करते हैं या उनकी एक तरह से उनको अनमास्क करते हैं. जो आपने पहली बात की थी कि how COVID-19 कम से कम अमेरिका में how that has taken a disproportionate toll on communities of color, on working class communities and so on. तो ये बात उससे भी जुड़ती है जो आपने अभी की. तो अगर आपकी इजाजत से अगर मैं कन्वर्सेशन को थोड़ा सा मैं एक मुख्तलिफ रुख में ले जाऊं, and in terms of thinking about the response to this, and I'm also trying to think of this response historically speaking. जो लोग इस गुफ्तगू को सुन रहे हैं या सुनेंगे, कम से कम I think कि थोड़ा सा agreement जो हम सबके दरमियान वो हो सकता है, वो ये है कि कम से कम जहाँ तक पाकिस्तान का ताल्लुक है, पाकिस्तान क्या कहिए बल्कि दीगर रियासतों का भी जो एक तरह से हाल है कि एक तरह से हमें एक पैरालिसिस नजर आता है. There seems to be in some ways not really knowing, a question of not really knowing what to do. और पाकिस्तान के केस में तो ये बहुत ही ज्यादा नजर आता है. So अगर हम तारीखी तनाजुर में अगर हम इसको समझ सकें कि how have responses to disease and epidemics, especially in the modern period, really shaped the way that pandemics, wreaked devastation and so on, या फिर उनको कंट्रोल वगैरह कैसे किया जाता है. तो अगर इस पे थोड़ी सी अगर हम गुफ्तगू कर सकें तो that would be great. Qasmi Sahab, I was wondering if I could start from you, perhaps, in terms of thinking about how, especially in the colonial period, आपने 1918 का जिक्र किया, आपने इन्फ्लुएंजा एपिडेमिक का जिक्र किया, आपने ये भी जिक्र किया कि किस तरह से ये एपिडेमिक फैला. तो अगर आप इस पे मजीद रोशनी डाल सकें कि किस तरह से उसको टैकल करने की क्या बेसिकली स्ट्रेटजीज थी, और उससे बुनियादी तौर पर what did that really reveal about the relationship between the state and the subject. मैं citizen तो नहीं कहूँगा चूंकि एक colonial context में किसी भी हिंदुस्तानी को citizen कहना शायद एक थोड़ी सी वो एक leap हो, मगर what did that really reveal about the relationship between the colonial state and Indian subjects.
मैं थोड़ा सा एक जो अभी वो कंस्पिरेसी थ्योरी का जिक्र हो रहा था उसमें मैं ऐड करना चाह रहा था कि जो द पावर ऑफ र्यूमर जो है ये कंस्पिरेसी थ्योरी है. आई मीन अगर आप इसके लिए यूज करना चाहें पावर ऑफ क्या कहते हैं उसको, weapon of the week का sort of एक जो idea है कि किस तरह it help people make sense of these things, especially in a context where science was not like it was not a apolitical kind of relationship. It was a master signifier, or a metaphor for progress, development, civilization. And so for that reason, there is a violent kind of relationship which exists between modern science, medicine, and colonial subjects, and which I think is related to the question that we have asked. और उसकी जो हमें, और जो डॉक्टर आमना इससे पहले भी बता चुकी हैं, जो मुख्तलिफ तरह की जो एक्सप्लेनेशंस थी डिजीज के हवाले से भी, कि जिसकी वजह से जो colonial responses है, the way a spatial kind of reshaping of urban landscape as it happens in case of India, कि जिसमें उनको लगता है कि they approach India as a diseased body, कि इसका क्लाइमेट ऐसा है, इसका पानी ऐसा है, इसकी आबो हवा ऐसी है कि ये एक डिजीज है. तो एक डिजीज बॉडी के तौर पर जो वेस्टर्न सिविलाइजेशनल एक रेमेडियल जो एक के तौर पर जो उभर कर सामने आता है, इट एड्स टू देयर role or justifies their role as a civilizational force, right? So it's not just about disease, it's not just about epidemic, it's about politics as well, as to how it's then played out in both ideological frames and with having like actual practical impacts in the way then they designed communities, habitation, cities, even villages, जो जब नहरी निज़ाम के तहत उन्होंने villages बनाए. और ये इसलिए मेरे ख्याल में डिजीज के साथ पब्लिक हेल्थ के जरिए जो स्टेट मेकिंग है, या थ्रू विच स्टेट पावर अनफोल्डेड in colonial India and its continuities in fact in post-colonial context is a very deep kind of a historical relationship, जिसकी मिसाल जो है आप कह सकते हैं कि जो एपिडेमिक डिजीजेस को डील करने के लिए जो लेजिस्लेशन थी जो 19वीं सदी के आखिर में की गई, जिसके जरिए रियासत के पास ये इख्तियार था, पावर था कि वो उसको बहुत हद तक इस्तेमाल कर सके, वो उसी पर डिपेंड करते हुए हिंदुस्तान और पाकिस्तान ने भी मुख्तलिफ अदवार में उन पावर्स को यूज़ किया है और उसको एक टूल के तौर पर इस्तेमाल किया, जिसके जरिए वो स्टेट पावर को आगे फैला सकते हैं और एक ख़ास तरह के सब्जेक्ट की या पोस्टल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में एक ख़ास तरह के सिटीजन की वो तश्कील कर सकते हैं.
Thank you for that. Kasim, would you want to weigh in on that question?
On the question of conspiracy or state response.
On the question of state response and what that really revealed about the relationship between the modern colonial state and Indian subjects, and whether we see some kind of continuity in those responses. And I'm thinking specifically of the responses of India and Pakistan, for that matter.
Yeah, I think I can even relate it back even to the question of conspiracy theories.
Sure,
that as a starting point to then unravel. It's also, you have to think of like, how does something become a conspiracy theory? Or like, how do we, there's also a process where we classify certain ideas as conspiracies, or as what Kasim was talking about, how something becomes a rumor. During the colonial period, there were monitoring ideas of rumors, like why is an idea considered a rumor when it's the subaltern, it's the peasant or the urban worker. So that's also really important, and like this kind of classification of certain ideas as rumors, as conspiracies, is sometimes a way of delegitimizing them. And you can also think about the conspiracies of the colonial state, like how they're propagating ideas that this is because of the hygiene of the poor. It's related to hygiene, but there's more to it than just hygiene. It's related to the colonial state, and which is really interesting because when you start seeing, and I think Ali Raza, you've probably seen it in your research as well, is that people who had anti-colonial ideas were thought of having a pathogen. That they had a virus, and that this was like spreading, and they were really feared the idea that the pathogen of anti-colonialism would spread. This idea that these are irrational ideas, that how could they even think of these crazy, like what were they thinking? Like and they also had to be contained. So the similar strategies, and this is the language they used. And so whenever you have an idea which is subversive, it's something which is irrational. It's like a pathogen. It's, spreads crazily. And that becomes also the state response to pathogens. Like, okay, these lower caste people, lower class individuals have to be separated from the elites. And that's also the structure of, urban and rural areas of this kind of separated kind of, even let's say how defense is today in Lahore, it's separate from, or the barricades. Maybe the barricades aren't so marked literally, but there is this kind of division between neighborhoods, to protect themselves from these unhygienic people. And so even during the colonial period, there is this kind of their response, the 1918 pandemic was mostly urban, and also for urban elites, certain neighborhoods, and not thinking, these were diseases which were more of an issue, in rural areas, or they became urban issues because people in the countryside were seeking assistance in urban areas and migrating to urban areas. And, the assistance that that the state was giving was mostly for elite populations. And so, that's how things are operating today. If there wasn't a functioning public health system in the colonial period for everyone, that's a similar situation today. And, if people are feeling also helpless today, it's because sovereignty isn't distributed equally. People don't really have control over their lives. The question of authoritarianism is coming. We often think, okay, there's a pandemic, military. But why do we always think about military as the response? And why is that the logical or natural idea for many people? Is because it's an institution which is overdeveloped. Why is that institution overdeveloped? And in comparison to other institutions, or let's say, and people having, let's say, a landless worker, in the countryside has very little sovereignty, little capacity of where they can live, where they can work. And so, there's a huge amount of helplessness there because people don't have sovereignty. But those who have, money, who have capital, who have influence, have enormous amount of sovereignty and an amount of influence in society. And there isn't really a question there for those people. Maybe some of their sovereignty is being questioned and power is being more centralized. But so these questions were also, at play in the 19th and 20th century.
Right. Thank you. Amna, if I could turn to you with the same question, but with an added, perhaps a twist, if I may call it that, because we just received a question on, and it's a worthwhile question to ask, I think. Because the question is, why is a debate always between the state and the subject? What about the private sector and their kind of initiatives, or perhaps some individual kind of initiative, perhaps? And as an expert on the history of public health in colonial India, I guess that you are best placed to answer that question.
Thank you. I'm very happy to take that question. It's an excellent question. And I think this is where history becomes very critical and crucial. What we see is that in the context of South Asia, not just the context of South Asia, worldwide, the state is the biggest provider of public health. And because of that reason, often the discussion becomes between state and subject. Now, in the case of Pakistan, what we see is, yes, the private sector is there, but it's not as robust. Robust isn't the right word for the public sector in Pakistan either, but it isn't as developed, shall we say, as the public sector is in terms of delivery of healthcare, or at least in terms of claiming the responsibility to deliver healthcare. However, when you see the context of the US, for instance, the conversation is very different. Over here, we do talk about the role of industry. We do talk about the role of the private sector, in part because much of healthcare is provided by private businesses. There's the lobby of medical insurance over here, which is all about people who are in the commercial sector, who are making money from the medical industrial complex, and who are providing these services. So over here, the discussion in the US is very much about how this pandemic is serving the interests of big pharmaceutical companies, or how it is being weaponized by them. It's also a discussion about how the lobbies over here pertaining to medical insurance companies are playing into the conversation. But that, I think, is a pretty much US affair, in part because the private industry around healthcare is so overdeveloped in this context. Yet in the rest of the world, the majority of the world, what we see is that healthcare is the purview of the state. And in fact, it's something that Kasim spoke about, I think, and also Usman spoke about, is that the provision of healthcare is a way in which the state legitimizes itself. It's its purview. It likes to think this is a service that it provides. It's a public good that the state takes on the responsibility for. And it's because of that persona of the state as the carer of the people, as providing the basic and delivering the basic needs, or catering to the basic needs of people, that the conversation becomes between state and people. And so if you think about colonial India, often the colonial state liked to call itself the maa baap, माई बाप जी, लोगों की ख्याल रख रहे हैं, खासकर जो आपका काश्तकार है उसका ख्याल रखा जा रहा है, जो आपके खेतों पे काम करते हैं या जो आपकी लोअर क्लासेस हैं, जो मिल हैंड्स हैं, उनका ख्याल रखते हैं. लेकिन इस ख्याल रखने में मतलब it's a huge political game as well. There is a political dimension to this. So casting yourself as the one who's going to take care of the population then of course opens up the room for the discussion to be one between the state and the people. So it draws those binaries very clearly because of the ways in which the state assumes the responsibility for provision of healthcare.
Thank you for that. So we have, okay, we don't have that much time left, and we have a lot of questions on our plate, but I guess one very interesting question that suddenly cropped up is along the lines of, well, how do we really view the impact of the pandemic on higher education? I mean, if there is a precedent for this, and why are we looking at the whole scale disruption of the education industry? I guess if I could just tag on to another question on top of that, which people have been asking of late, especially of late, especially as the economic effects of the pandemic become more evident, is that are we overreacting in some ways? Have we perhaps become more sensitive to disease and the outbreak of disease and the kind of impact that it has, instead of simply just treating it as a fact of life? And I guess it's a much larger question than the disruption of the education industry as a whole. But if there are any thoughts on that, I mean, if any one of you want to kind of take a shot at it. Amna, please go ahead.
I'm happy to talk about the impact on higher ed.
Please.
I think higher ed has become a bigger industry now. It's the biggest industry, or historically, it's bigger now than it ever has been. So we're talking and debating about the impact on higher ed, in part because now people travel long distances to go and seek an education in a way that they didn't before. So that's part of the kind of context in which we have to look at this. The other piece about higher ed is, I think, we are finding that the technology today provides us with novel ways of dealing with the situation. For instance, the pandemic is making it possible for all of us to have a conversation right now, which is informed by higher ed and is publicly facing. So I think I'm not quite sure about whether we can talk about a precedent of this. I think this here we are in uncharted waters in terms of what the impact on higher ed will be, but we're also in a moment where there's a lot of creativity around how higher ed can be delivered. And there, I think we're in exceptional circumstances compared to before.
And so to move on from there, and I completely agree with you. I mean, this is, I guess, when it comes to thinking about, perhaps starting off with a question that we began our discussion with, which was, what is really novel about this? I guess that effect on higher ed and the education industry as a whole. I think really have no precedent for in some ways, thinking about us, at least historically, at least when it comes to the kind of disruption that this pandemic has wrought on higher education institutions. If that is the case, then perhaps that segs in very neatly with the very last question that I had for all of you, smart people, smart historians, which is to perhaps answer and to reply to the skepticism that certain people may have कि जी के तारीख का क्या फायदा है और तारीख से हमें क्या सबक मिलेगा when it comes to navigating this present crisis. What on earth, if at all, does history have to teach us about this moment, and more importantly, about how we ought to navigate this crisis, and perhaps on a more hopeful note, dream of other and better futures in which one can perhaps see less of this devastation than what we are witnessing at this present juncture. वही मेरा बुनियादी सवाल वही है कि तारीख हमें क्या सबक सिखाती है, जो हर नानी अम्मा जो है वो बेसिकली, मेरी नानी तो कम से कम मुझसे जरूर ये सिखाती थी मुझे कि जी बेटा तारीख ये सबक सिखाती है, तो आपको तारीख क्या सबक सिखाती है when it comes to thinking about this moment and as I said, thinking about an alternative future for all of us.
Qasmi,
we can begin with you. Yes.
Very briefly, I think तमाम लोग ही जवाब देना चाहेंगे, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल में कि तारीख का मकसद ये तो नहीं ना, वो तो एक बहुत आसान सी बात है, वो तो विकिपीडिया एंट्री है। अगर हम बताना चाहें कि इन्फ्लुएंजा एपिडेमिक के नतीजे में कितने लोग हलाक हुए और बाकी एपिडेमिक्स के, so the real question is that of understanding, of power, and how it is played out and how it's been responsible. जैसे कासिम तिरमिजी ने जो अपने आर्टिकल में अपने काम में, या आमना ने अपने काम में जिस तरह बताया है कि how other factors are involved as well. It's not just about disease itself. The other factors which contribute towards the setting up of an institutional apparatus which contributes towards death, why certain groups are more marginalized, more vulnerable than others. So I think अगर ये critique develop हो तारीख के मुताले के जरिए, that can perhaps lead towards or contribute towards a new idea of politics. Politics के साथ जुड़ सके, जो इस तरह के, जिस तरह का कासिम दोबारा जिक्र कर रहे थे कि ओवर डेवलप्ड इंस्टीट्यूशंस को और उसकी पॉलिटिक्स को चैलेंज कर सके, या जिस तरह डॉक्टर आमना बात कर रही थी जो प्रोविजन ऑफ पब्लिक हेल्थ के हवाले से, इन क्वेश्चंस को जो चैलेंज कर सके, ये वो क्रिटिक डेवलप करने में ये तारीख हमारी मदद कर सकती है. So मेरे नज़दीक तो it has to be a critique of power and its various structures, and it has to connect with a new kind of politics which we can sort of through which we can imagine a new ideal, which can help us get rid of the new liberal economic model which has been prevalent and which has been responsible for such an unmitigated disaster that we see.
Kasim?
I mean, so again, if we, having this perspective, let's say, historicizing a pandemic. I mean, so again, what I was emphasizing before is, this importance of looking at the historical and social processes that make a pandemic. And so if we start doing that work, and we start untangling what are those historical and social processes that create vulnerability, that creates a pandemic, then we start, unraveling, let's say, during the 19th and 20th, early 20th century, when there were pandemics, during the colonial period, it was because of colonialism. It was because of the emergence and connecting of South Asia within global capitalist relations. And those need to be then addressed. And so if we're thinking, and those are the ideas also of, anti-colonial radicals at the time, who saw that, when there was a famine, when there were, let's say, pandemics, it was related to the role of the colonial state. And so if we fast forward to today, the question of food, which I was bringing up earlier, is, still very important. And, for many people in the global south or the third world, they're actually more worried about access to food or say dying from hunger during this period than compared to dying from the pandemic. I mean, obviously those things are interconnected. And, if we're thinking about, let's say, how do we address food security at this time, which is going to be a very serious issue? And you have to think about who controls food, who controls work. And then it comes back to like this, the fabric that we're living in, how society is organized, is connected to capitalism, is connected to neocolonialism. Where there's trade agreements which are decided and are through other countries, or even within society, let's say in Pakistan, land distribution is highly unequal, and people's capacity to feed themselves is connected to their capacity to have access to land. And so to really address, let's say, this pandemic, or to address a crisis which was already existing before the pandemic, and also, there is a possibility of having other pandemics in the future. To really address those and to have, let's say, equity, we'd have to look at those social processes. And so thinking about other economic models, thinking about other ways of organizing politics, and those where sovereignty is redistributed. And I'm also thinking, we have to really center those individuals, or say those groups of people who are the most vulnerable, specifically, so those who are, let's say, landless, those who, let's say, especially women, thinking about workers. And like, if we have another foreign politics, centering those groups is central in thinking about having and addressing ways in which we can get out of a pandemic.
Thank you, Kasim. Amna, final word, if you want to reflect on that question.
I think the things that have already been said are very important. That looking at history, तारीख पढ़ने से हमें ये पता चलता है कि these pandemics are not just medical issues. It's not just about a virus or a microbe, but the ways in which they spread is determined in society through socioeconomic structures. And if we can begin to understand that, then what we begin to appreciate is that we have agency. We have agency, या हम कुछ कर सकते हैं, हम बदल सकते हैं दुनिया को, और उसको, and we can change the impact of these pandemics, not necessarily by creating a vaccine. That's a very good thing to do. And I think the emphasis on how the vaccine is going to solve everything is of course very important, but it detracts from how the problem, even once we have a vaccine, is how is it going to be delivered? Who's going to have access to it? Who are the people who are going to be able to afford it? These are all questions which lie at the heart of how a society is going to respond to a pandemic. So I think the biggest thing that history teaches us is to look beyond the very medical definition of what a pandemic is, to pay attention to the social factors that are responsible for the spread, and then to help us think about how can we mitigate the spread by addressing those socioeconomic factors that the other two on the panel have already highlighted.
I think that's an excellent note with which to wrap up, which to me at least has been a very illuminating conversation. अगर तो कोई साहिबाने इख्तियार हमारी बात सुन रहे हैं तो उनसे बस एक गुजारिश है कि हिस्टोरियंस की, सोशल साइंटिस्ट्स की, ह्यूमैनिटीज वालों को भी बात सुन लिया करें. शायद हमारे पास कुछ बातें हों कहने की जो आपके काम आए. And on that note, thank you all for tuning in what is the 16th session of the LUMS Live series. I hope you will continue joining us for these conversations. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to my colleague Usman Qasmi, to Dr. Kasim Tirmizey, and to Dr. Amna Khalid, who are tuning in from Canada and the United States respectively. I am deeply grateful to you both, especially for taking time out on what I have no doubt is a very early morning for you. And so thank you so much for joining us. I am Ali Raza, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.